From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, syndicating across the country on the Business Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC.com, and 1490 AM WGCH, Greenwich, Connecticut. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. God's banker, intrigue, financial scandal, money laundering, murder inside the Vatican Bank, which makes Wall Street look like choir boys. The financial thriller with a top investigative journalist today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Gerald Posner wrote Case Closed, the definitive book on the JFK assassination, ruling out conspiracy theories. And on the 50th anniversary, participated in what we call an epic debate on this show with the leading proponent of conspiracy theories. He's written 11 other books. He's known for his intense research that goes into each book. This book is God's Banker, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. Welcome back, Gerald.
Jim, a great pleasure to be back with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, first off, how the heck did you maintain sustained intensity for 10 years on this book, and why did you decide to write it?
I decided to write it because it actually went back to the early 1980s. I was then doing a pro bono lawsuit as an attorney for a group of survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp who had been medical experiments of this notorious Dr. Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. And that lawsuit was thrown out of federal court, but I turned it into a biography of Mengele. And in the research on it, I went down to South America. I was able to get into the archives of the federal police down in Buenos Aires. And in those archives, I came across files of Nazis who had arrived in South America after World War II, fugitives who were wanted for war crimes, and some of them have been assisted by a Father Weber in Rome, a Catholic priest, and another by a Bishop Udall in Rome. And I thought that sort of lit up in the back of my mind this idea of a Vatican-Nazi connection. I knew it was something I wanted to look at more over the years, and I didn't get a chance until the turn of this century to find a publisher that was finally interested in letting me go and do that. What I thought was going to be a look really at what happened with the rat line, the so-called rat line of Nazi fugitives and the assistance of the Vatican out of Europe in World War II, turned into a book about money that extended a couple of decades before and a couple of decades after. And the next thing I knew, over a few years, as you said, on and off for nearly 9 years with this, with one book in between, it became a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican, follow the money with the church.
In fact, as it says in the book, or you quote somebody, you can't run a church on Hail Marys, so we do have a bit of a dark side here. It struck me as I got into this that really you need to look at the Vatican, the bank, the Curia, through a prism as a political and bureaucratic institution almost before looking at it as a religious institution.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because people view it, just as a religious institution. They definitely run in parallel, and that's true because what I think a lot of us forget is that there was a time when both existed. What I mean by that is before 1870, they were Pope kings. They not only were popes, the heads of the Catholic Church, but they had empires, just like the French king and the German kings and Italian princes. 15,000 square miles of central Italy called the Papal States. They levied taxes like any other king, and they picked them up. And the court of the Pope, like the court of the royal monarchies, grew to like 700 and 800 people. It was lavish. It's only when they lost their kingdom to Italian nationalists, when Italy became a united country, and they were reduced to this little, tiny little size of land, a postage stamp called Vatican City, that they had to figure out other ways to raise money.
Most people don't know, including probably me when I started, what is the Vatican Bank?
Well, the Vatican Bank is, I call it a bit like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. because it is the main and only bank, official bank for our country. The Vatican is, of course, a sovereign nation in addition to being a religion, one of the world's largest religions, the largest ever until it was recently passed by Muslims. It has 1.3 million Catholics around the world. And the bank is a bit like Federal Reserve, but also more like a private bank, a bit like an investment bank. It doesn't make any loans. It was formed in the middle of World War II by Pope Pius XII. The Pope is the only shareholder. It has no requirement to turn a profit. Until 2001, it used to destroy all its records every 10 years. It operates in the dark, which is part of the problem for why there are some low lights in the history of the Vatican Bank. And it is an unusual hybrid institution that many people have questioned over the years. Why does the Vatican need a bank? But it has used it very aggressively over time.
Okay, the most surprising thing you uncovered and the most outrageous?
I think the most surprising thing I uncovered was a document in the National Archives, which had not seen the light of day before, that raises a real question as to whether the financial wizard, and I don't use that word lightly, he really was a wizard, this layman who ran the Vatican finances for over 20 years, 25 years, and formed the Vatican Bank with the Pope in the middle of the war, whether he might have had ties or been an agent for Nazi intelligence. There are serious questions about that from this one document from American intelligence. That was the most surprising. The most outrageous to me was that even after decades of scandals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in which the bank had been tied to some of the most notorious money men in Italy and scandals that brought down banks and hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud, in the 90s and 2000s, it was still being used by Italy's top politicians, including the man who had been a 7-time prime minister, for political slush funds running tens of millions of dollars through the bank to dole out favors to politicians and individuals. I could not believe, it was outrageous to me that even after decades of abuse and scandals and having the spotlight on it, it was still doing outrageous things.
Yeah, the book is just chock full of stuff, and I want to use the rest of this first segment to go through some of them very briefly before we get into detail so people can see how this all fits together. So why don't you talk about money laundering? And we're talking there's mob, the elite of Italy, the politicians you just said, and dealing in all these areas like Luxembourg, Panama, Switzerland, that also have very secrecy laws, so allows this laundering.
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, the Vatican Bank, when it was formed, essentially operates as an offshore bank, just like the offshore banks in Liechtenstein and Luxembourg and Switzerland, cloaked in secrecy. Nobody else has ever been, until the last few years when they finally opened their books to European regulators, nobody was ever able to look inside to see what was there. And that's why it is what I say, Jim, is an offshore bank in the heart of Rome. It would be as if your listeners who know New York City thought that 30th to 35th Street was its own independent country, but there was no wall on 35th Street or on 30th Street. So if you were in New York, all you had to do was deposit your money into the bank between 30th and 35th Street, and no one else in New York from the city or the state or federal prosecutors or the IRS could find out that your money was in that country, in those 5 blocks, and they could never touch it. That's what the Vatican Bank is like, and that's why it attracted the ultra-wealthy looking to evade taxes, the mafia, and so much money laundering.
And there was laundering of gold taken from Jewish Holocaust victims.
Yeah, I think that the gold comes down to 2 big questions, and I'm asking the Vatican to sort of try to release those Holocaust-era files. Gold that was looted from the National Treasury of Croatia at the end of the war by these fascists who had been involved in murder. They ended up at a seminary in Rome where a Croatian monk was sending people to South America, and then there's a report from an American intelligence agent that the gold was taken to St. Peter's and put inside the Vatican, where it disappeared. And the other is a gold that comes from a doctor who had been the previous pope before the war's personal physician. His daughter was the mistress of Mussolini, and his stash of gold, according to American intelligence, ended up in the Vatican. We've never seen what happened to it after that.
Now, we've got instances, we'll get into murders, deaths, even poisonings, in relating to all of this stuff. Do you come down that there's fundamental incompetence in the management of the Vatican Bank, or fraudulent behavior that was purposeful?
Well, I think it's both. The most of it is bad management. The men who are cut out to be clerics, who want to give a celibate life to the church and want to serve other people, in the best of ways, if everything else is good, they may not be very good at handling money, and they've proven that time and again. So the American bishop who ran the Vatican Bank for 20 years was just way out of his league and was taken in time and time again and swindled by Italians who were much sharper than he was. There are also those fraud. There's just a fellow arrested a year and a half ago called Monsignor Dom 500. He was called that Monsignor 500 because his favorite banknote was the 500 euro, which was then worth about $800, and he brought in $20 million. He had a plan on a jet plane from Switzerland for some wealthy Italians. That's just straight-out fraud.
We got about a minute and a half to go. What about the Roman Curia, which is this bureaucratic entity that's sort of hard to understand that I know Francis is trying to take on, Pope Francis?
Yeah, well, that's a bit like the change of presidents here. You change the president, but a lot of the bureaucracy underneath the president stays the same and stays entrenched and goes on forever. Well, that's magnified by 10 in terms of the Vatican. The bureaucracy that's underneath the Pope stays no matter how long, the Pope is there for 10 years or 5 years or 30 years. there's that solid bureaucracy, and it's often the same types of people. It goes off to nephews. It comes in from somebody else who's a friend. It's a very close group. There are only 900 people working inside the Vatican in Vatican City as clerics. They live and work together. You have to think of it as a very incestuous group in terms of that inside relationship, and as a result, it breeds contempt sometimes. It breeds fights for power. And the Curie has outlasted every pope. It has the view that no matter what the popes try to do to tame it, it will outlive to another pope and will maintain its power. And that's the challenge for Francis. Can he prevail over this bureaucracy that has been there for hundreds of years, or 1,800 to 2,000 years, or can he actually tame it?
Coming next, we'll look back in a little bit more detail at the history of the Vatican Bank.
Would you like to host your own radio program or podcast? Park City Productions 06604 is a Bridgeport, Connecticut-based radio broadcast solutions company. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's Park City Productions 06604. Call us at 203-522-8801.
And we're back with investigative journalist Gerald Posner. Look at bit of the dark side of the Vatican history now, and we were talking a little bit about the Nazis and the Vatican Bank and collusion with fascists in Italy. Talk a little bit about the killing fields in Eastern Europe, and there was the ethnic cleansing and sort of the priestly involvement.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is the Vatican had probably earlier information about the civilian massacres that were taking place in Poland, Romania, Croatia. Croatia was a Catholic country, and there were priests involved. The head of Croatia was a Catholic priest. In Slovakia, there was a Catholic priest near the helm. There were priests involved in some of the concentration camps in Croatia. Now, this was a small minority, so I'm not saying most priests were not, but it certainly gave many parishioners the idea that there was an endorsement by the fact of the clergy being involved in the murders in some cases, but they also saw the murders. And what I mean by that is the Pope had something that no Western country, the British and Americans, didn't have. He had priests in these little parishes and towns in Poland where the killings were taking place and scattered around the west of Eastern Europe, and they would report what they saw to their bishops, and the bishops would send it back to the Secretary of State's office in the Vatican, and the Pope Pius, was a hands-on micromanager. And then the question becomes, with all those early reports, why weren't they a bit more aggressive? And that's kept historians debating forever.
The Nazis put in a 10% tax on German Catholics, which they funneled back, which could have looked like helping to buy off the Pope. Joe Kennedy was at one point sort of pro-Hitler because it was great for business. Do you think if you go back into that context, you give the Vatican a little bit of a break because of that?
Oh, yeah, no, I do think that that was clearly a factor. And you mentioned something very important when you mentioned the tax. In Germany and a few other countries there, but Germany, they had collected from the time of Bismarck, the Catholic Church, an 8 to 10% tax, very little bit, on total income. But it was a voluntary contribution, meaning that you had your income and then you had to report to the church, I made $30,000 and here's my $3,000. Hitler said in a 1933 deal with the Vatican, you recognize me. They became the first country to do so, the Vatican did. Then I'll do some things for you. And one of them, I will collect the tax at the source, as like a payroll tax. When a company pays it out at Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz or whatever else, we'll take that and send it right over to you. By 1942 and 43, in the middle of the war, Vatican was collecting $100 million. That was big money back then from that tax. And it clearly had a way on their mind that if they spoke out or moved against the Nazis on the issue of civilian killings, Hitler might well keep that money for himself and put the Vatican in a bind. Hitler might even move against Catholics in Germany or try to bring the Pope back to Germany as a prisoner. I'm not excusing the Pope's silence, but I understand there are reasons why they may have been timid about speaking out more forcefully.
And one thing that was kind of outrageous was at one point they were splitting profits on like insurance annuities or insurance which they weren't paying off to Holocaust victims.
Yeah, well, I think, there's an instance in which the Vatican was invested in insurance companies, the biggest Italian insurance companies like Generali. They had a majority stake in a smaller one, the fourth largest, this one called Fondi Aria. And those companies in the latter stages of the war started to steal essentially the life insurance policies early of Jews that they knew were being sent to the death camps. there's no evidence that the Vatican knew about that theft.
Mm-hmm.
They earned the profits by their stakes in the companies, but it's still a moral problem for them going forward. I'm the first book to really talk about that.
Is there a moral problem with relationship with Mussolini?
Well, it's. I guess for them it was a question. When I say that, the sigh is that it was a question for the Vatican of the lesser of two evils, and the greater evil than Mussolini, as far as they were concerned, were the Reds, the communists, the Bolsheviks in Russia. The Stalin and the communists were destroying synagogues and Russian Orthodox churches and Catholic churches. They were equal opportunity atheists. Mussolini had a moral code that fit with the Vatican, and that meant no abortion, large families, strict morality, and in terms of the social code, it was fine. He was a Catholic, and he eventually came out, although he was anti-Catholic in some ways, he eventually got baptized publicly, he got remarried by a priest, and he gave the Vatican more power than it had since it's lost its empire. He's the one who acknowledged them as a separate country, their own sovereign rights. They had no right to do anything else except run it as a sovereign nation, and the Vatican in turn gave him the acknowledgement in 1929 that he was the real deal, that he had their support in Italy, and every Italian home had a picture of Mussolini on the wall and a crucifix next to it.
It was. I didn't realize until I read too that the entire Vatican now is reduced to like 2/3 of a mile or something. The perimeter.
It's incredibly small. I mean, people don't realize when it has a flag at the UN and it has so many followers around the world. It's the only country that I say this. I always hesitate saying only because I'm ready for somebody to call you up later and say no. There's another country. It's the only country that I believe in the world owns more real estate outside of its size than the country itself. Far more property around the world owned by the Vatican than the size of the country itself. You can walk across it in 20 minutes.
Looking at some of the intrigue now, there were thoughts that Pope John Paul might have been the intended one to be poisoned, and Pope John Paul died, and there were rumors there. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in 1978, after 15 years as Pope, Pope Paul VI had died, and when they went to pick the new Pope, the conclave took place, and they picked the Patriarch of Venice, the Cardinal of Venice, and he took the name Pope, John Paul I. He died 33 years later. While he was Pope, before he died, there was an Orthodox bishop who came to visit him, and while they were having coffee, that bishop keeled over, had a heart attack, and died. It was just after the Pope gave him a cup of coffee. So the rumors in the Vatican, maybe that was a poisoned coffee meant for the Pope, because this Pope promised to be the guy who was going to reform the Curia that you talked about before, Jim, maybe change the Vatican Bank. He might even fire the head of the Vatican Bank. And then 33 days after becoming Pope, he's dead, and the Vatican screws up everything about his death. They don't have an autopsy. They lie about how he was discovered because a nun discovered him early in the morning. They thought that might not look good because a woman discovered him. And so it just becomes a disaster. A writer put out a book that said the Pope was murdered. I think it sold 6 million copies. In the end, I conclude the Pope was not murdered, but his death was handled in a way that fed conspiracy theories from day one.
Going down to a minute and a half here or so, I hadn't realized the extent to which John Paul II, obviously coming out of Poland, was so virulently anti-communist, but that he worked pretty closely with William Casey and the CIA, and then maybe the guy that tried to assassinate him was attached to the Bulgarian Secret Service.
Yeah, it was it was Cold War drama, no doubt. I mean, John Paul becomes Pope. The Polish Pope takes over at a time when the communists still run his country. 5 months later, Margaret Thatcher becomes the Prime Minister of England, and 2 years later, Ronald Reagan, the President of the U.S. They are soulmates on this ideology against communism, and the Pope uses the Vatican Bank with Reagan's help, and as you said, Casey and the CIA, to send money back to Solidarity. At the same time, the priests on the ground provide information and intelligence back to the CIA that they love, the same type of intelligence that came in World War II about the civilian killings was now available to tell them what was happening about the communists. And I described for the first time an instance in which $3 million in gold ingots are stuffed into the fake sides of a SUV and the bottom of an SUV, and a priest drives it from Rome back to Gdansk. This is the type of stuff that was happening back in the height of the Cold War with the Pope and Thatcher and Reagan.
Business Talk with Jim Campbell can be heard on Business Talk Radio Network Sundays 10 a.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern. Then it's repeated again 10 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station nearest to you, or listen on the Internet. Go see some of our podcasts. Next, we're going to talk about unraveling illegal financial moves. We're talking with Gerald Posner. He's the author of a new book, God's Banker, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. We're going to follow the money now. The Vatican ran quite a laundry service. But I got to start off, the book starts off, and there is first of all, the IOR is what Institutes for Works of Religion, which is what the Vatican Bank is known at. That's got to be one of the all-time great misnomers.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's like the peacekeeper for the missiles that we used to have under Ronald Reagan. That.
Okay, start off with there's a body hanging from a rope off a London bridge, Mr. Roberto Calvi.
Yeah, the book actually opens, that's right, with a fellow going to work to the newspaper where he works every day, and he's walking underneath this bridge, Blackfriars, in London along the river, and thinks he sees something. When he looks closer, it is in fact a body dangling with a noose around its neck. And when Scotland Yard gets involved, they find out that it's an Italian banker called Calvi. He's arrived in London a couple of days later under a false name. And then they discover that he's wanted actually for having been convicted in Italy and having fled the country. It turns out that he was a banker near the top of his business, involved heavily with the Vatican Bank on all hundreds of millions of dollars of what were the sort of back and forth loans, many of them to bolster the balance sheet of companies, a major fraud. And not only that, but he had passed along some of the money to Solidarity, the Polish resistance movement, at the behest of the Vatican Bank when they were ferreting money over there. He was deemed a suicide. That's what the British said. And it took about 25 years before eventually the family was able to prove with multiple investigations it was in fact a murder. 5 Italians, including mobsters, were charged for it. Everybody waited to see what would happen and if the Vatican Bank would be involved. And all 5 were acquitted in the Italian judicial system a few years ago, so that case remains an unsolved murder.
Do you have any sense of motive?
I think that Calvi made so many enemies that it would, if you had the suspect list, you couldn't have a short list. It would be a long list, because what happened is the mob was making money with him, the Vatican Bank was making money with him, wealthy Italians were making money with him, because he had a great scheme, not really a Ponzi scheme, but he had a very complicated offshore system that survived as long as it continued to grow. So as it was growing, there was enough money for everybody to be happy. But once one part of it came under stress, as these things often happen, then everything came undone. So there was a long stream of people that had it in for him.
And I think it's just still amazing to think that money was funneled through here without any disclosure to bad people for drugs, with murders involved. And this is going through the Vatican Bank. And there's a Kazimir Marcinkus, if I pronounce that right, from Chicago, which is my hometown. He was the Pope's body man, and somehow he ran this bank.
Yeah, Marcinkus is a great guy. He's a character straight out of Hollywood. He's 6'3", 6'4". He's American. He goes in the seminary, becomes a priest, goes to Rome, and he's the quintessential American. He's always got something cooking. A lot of the Italians didn't like him. They thought he was too boisterous, too outgoing, a little too much of a backslapper. But the popes liked him, and they used him on these logistics and advanced trips as almost a quasi-bodyguard and then the guy to arrange everything. He was great with details. He got moved over to the bank. This is vintage Vatican. Here's an institution that doesn't know much about money. So what do? They pick a priest that they like, who they think's gregarious and outgoing. He's American. He must know about money. And they move him over to run the Vatican Bank when he doesn't know anything. He buys a few books, later lies to a reporter and said he took a couple-week course at Harvard. He did not. And he's running this multi-billion-dollar institution for 20 years. And we should have seen from the very beginning, somebody should have seen at the Vatican, it was going to be trouble, because one of the first things he does is he becomes a director on a Nassau Bahamian offshore bank that's formed by Calvi. The head of the Vatican Bank should never be a director of an offshore bank in the Bahamas. So that was a bad sign from the get-go.
You can't even make this stuff up. Do you there's money going through here, and he's taking sort of kickbacks for doing it, but he's not personally, right? He's not stealing money himself.
Yeah, it was very interesting. The Italian prosecutors at one point had evidence that he had split a $6.5 million commission together with Calvi on the sale of a Venetian bank that was owned by the Catholic Church to Calvi, of course, of all people. But that money may well have become part of what was like a slush fund that Marcinkus would use when the Pope needed something as a special favor, like funding Solidarity or funding the resistance to the communist movement. It was a way for Marcinkus to buy more power for himself at the Vatican, because remember, this is often a fight for power closest to the Pope, who has the most authority. And there's no evidence that he really went off and enriched himself, but he definitely was involved in a whole bunch of things that broke the line. And the ultimate was, Jim, that eventually the Italians indicted him. They said, all right, that's it. They indicted him for fraudulent bankruptcy and a laundry list of crimes, including his two top assistants. The Vatican refused to accept the warrants. This is in the late 80s. They fought them. They said, we're a sovereign country. Italy said, that's crazy. If somebody commits an offense in Italy, like drug trafficking, and then they seek safe haven in the Vatican, you can't refuse to hand them over. That went to the Supreme Court of Italy, which sided with the Vatican. That was the end of the process, and eventually Marcinkus resigned from his post and spent the last years of his life in Sun City, Arizona, running a small parish in a retirement community. And
they also laundered a huge amount of counterfeit securities.
Yeah, there's a chapter in here called Operation Fräulein, after the name that the FBI had given it, where I talked for the first time about some of the meetings the FBI agent and the Justice Department officials had. They stumbled across a mafia plan to sell hundreds of millions of dollars of fake stock certificates and treasury bills, and then they find that one of the buyers might be the Vatican. And they followed that straight back to the Vatican. It ends up in a great moment in which the head of the task force for the Justice Department and one of the chief prosecutors, FBI agent, are sitting inside the Vatican talking to Marcinkus, of all people, who's trying to convince them that they've come to the wrong place, that he would never in any case buy anything that was fake. And in the end, the FBI agent says to me, and the head of the task force, as you know in the book, we just never had enough to charge him. They charged a whole bunch of people with crimes over that. They just never could clear him, nor did they have enough to charge him, but they were suspicious.
And this guy, Michel Sindona, who ran the Franklin Bank, which also collapsed and was involved with Calvi's bank, he has somebody murdered, who's, I guess, the liquidator of his bank, and then he himself commits suicide.
Yeah, you know, Sindona is an amazing character because Nicola Sindona was one of the business titans from Italy. Calvi was very important as a banker, but Sindona was known internationally, so that Time magazine and the New York Times and others were writing about him as he was coming up on his career. He was a Sicilian lawyer who made it big in Milan in terms of banks, and he did business with the Vatican. He got introduced through one of the Vatican bank assistants there, and they called him a wizard. They thought he was ahead of his time, and then he came to the U.S. and bought Franklin National. And that became the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history when it went under at that time. And Sindona turned out to be involved in all types of fraud, together with the Vatican Bank. And the fellow who was investigating him in Italy, this prosecutor, ends up dead, shot to death. Sindona is the guy who ordered the murder. And by the time the Italians get him back in the 80s to put him on trial because he's convicted here in the U.S. of bankruptcy fraud for Franklin, shortly after being convicted, in a high-security section of the prison made just for him, where his food is looked at by two people before it's brought to him and is sealed, he takes a sip of espresso and goes, and he says, I've been poisoned, in Italian, I've been poisoned, stumbles to the front door and he's dead. And it's cyanide poisoning. The official conclusion by the Italians, suicide.
And you can't make this stuff up. This Enemot, I'm pronouncing that right, scandal that involved $100 million of bribes to Italian politicians. $75 million went through the Vatican Bank.
Okay, so there's something about this, which you're right. You're talking about what they call the clean hands prosecutions, the largest scandal in post-war Italy. And I tell you, if you say the largest scandal in Italy, you're talking about a big scandal because there have been plenty of scandals. And I'm half Italian, so I can say that. I know this country. My mother was Italian. One of the things was that when they finally unraveled it, and there were convictions from Parliament, there were top business people convicted, they indicted several hundred over a period of 8 or 9 years. They discovered these accounts inside the Vatican where the biggest politicians were using it because they knew that the Italians could not get inside the Vatican Bank. They did find them only later from leaks. A Monsignor working inside the Vatican Bank who was sickened by the whole process stole bits of paper and information and on his death left instructions that it should be given to an investigative reporter in Italy, which it was, and he wrote a book about it and blew the top off everything. Otherwise, nobody would have known about the Vatican's roles.
Now, we're down to about the last minute or so, and we've just gone through all these illegal money laundering, offshore kind of stuff, and the Vatican has really never been held accountable for it legally, but they did make a settlement admitting moral involvement.
You know, I'm glad you reminded me of that, Jim. It's one of my favorite things is as a result of Marcinkus' running of the Vatican Bank and all the relationships with Calvi and the banks that were hurt, the Vatican finally contributed $244 million, $250 million back in the 80s, to what they called a settlement for, quote, moral considerations. Now, can you imagine anyone in the world giving $250 million away for moral considerations? This is an institution that won't part with a dollar if it doesn't have to. I mean, they had to make that settlement. They were given that language, so it didn't look as though they had done anything wrong. But that's the best evidence of anything else that the Vatican Bank had really crossed the line.
Go to CampbellBizTalk.com, sign up for our email blast. We send out to 55,000 folks every week, and you can advertise on it if you like. Our final national segment of Vatican Money Reformation.
Hi, I'm Ryan Perry with Brookfield Technology Center, a women-owned, Native American-owned minority business. We do phone systems, video surveillance, firewalls, servers, door access control, all your cabling needs.
And why do people want to call a professional to protect themselves?
Well, a lot of times you need to make sure you're up to date. People think they buy the equipment and that's it, they install it. But a lot of times you need to do all the updates and perform all the maintenance on it to keep it running properly.
And that's what you do here at Brookfield Technology Center.
Yes, we do monthly contracts, or we can remote in and or come to site and make sure it's all up to date and make sure you're in compliance.
And how do people get in touch with you?
You can give us a call at 203-775-5009 or look us up on the web, www.btcamerica.com.
And the slogan is Brookfield Technology Center.
All things computer.
We're talking to Gerald Posner on his investigation of the Vatican. So here we are now. We've got a new pope who's supposedly a reformer. Is the Vatican going clean?
You know, I don't want to sound Pollyannish about this, but I think that it is on the road to going clean. When Francis became pope in 2013 and he gave the talk about he was going to be a reformer and change the bank, he might even get rid of the bank. But popes have said that before, so I just thought he was paying lip service to it possibly. But he has instituted a series of reforms that is starting the process of transparency, letting European regulators be more aggressively looking at what the bank does, closing hundreds of accounts that belong to people that shouldn't have had them, publishing a rudimentary financial statement that can be looked at. The question is, Jim, will he be pope long enough to change the culture of the bank? He's 78. You know, you come in, you make the new rule changes, and then it's only for 2 or 3 years. The underlying culture that has been used to operating in the dark may be resistant to that change. So he has to be there long enough, and we don't know the answer of how long he'll be pope, to see if he can really make this work.
Why do they need a bank?
You asked the right question. They don't really need a bank. They could do everything they need to do as they did before World War II through correspondent banks. They absolutely don't need their own bank. It's not as though they set interest rates in their own currency or anything else. So they could do without it, but they like the bank for the following reason today more than anything else, and that is they raise a lot of money in the third world, in African countries, South America, Latin America, in cash. So big amounts of cash come in. It's proven to be a problem with them in some countries that are, quasi-terror states because they operate everywhere, Catholic charities. That cash comes back into the Vatican to accounts there. They don't want people to know this order the Jesuits has $1.4 billion. The Franciscans have $1.2 billion. And this charity out here in New Delhi just raised $100 million. They like to keep it all under wraps. That's part of the problem they've had. Because it comes in cash and because nobody really talks about the numbers, fake accounts were set up, like the Francis Spellman Foundation, through which hundreds of millions passed, and it turned out to just be fake money or laundered money. So you have to watch out for that. But the Vatican still likes its secrecy to the cash it raises for all of its charities and its.
Will the bank reach a stage? I mean, they're a sovereign nation, of course, that they are transparent so that they can't launder.
Yes, absolutely. The way that Francis has said it now, the reforms that he has set forward, this is going to become, unless a regressive pope takes over, or unless something untoward happens and Francis changes his mind, this pope is going to turn this bank into an ordinary, boring bank. It will have, in the future, an occasional scandal, as every bank does. Some rogue trader may do something wrong. That'll happen at Goldman Sachs or at Barclays or wherever. Somebody may steal some money. You may have a bad Monsignor who's sending something off to, a family member. But it won't be institutionally inept and so compromised as an offshore bank as it has been in the past.
Can he tame the Curia?
That will be much tougher. Can he tame the financial part of the Vatican Bank? I believe so. Can he tame the Curia? I think he's Pope, but not a miracle worker. It's hard to imagine that. And the reason I say that is the Curia is still largely Italian, and therefore you have to think of it in this format. If this church had been founded 2,000 years ago in Germany, it'd be a very different church for the personality it had. It reflects the country around it. Italy has had, 4.5 dozen governments since World War II. It has corruption scandal after corruption scandal. There's nepotism. There's the hiring problems. There's inefficiencies that take place. Why should we think that the Vatican, which is primarily Italian in its constitution, the Curia, would be much different than the Italian country around it? So I think it reflects the society that is there in Italy. It's also reflected inside the Vatican. That's the hard part to change, and that's why many of the appointments that Francis has made are Australians, South Americans, Europeans. He's trying to reduce the number of Italians, much to the chagrin of the Italian power base. They are hungry to get the papacy back. They've had a Polish pope who was there from 1978 to 2005. They had a German pope from 2005 into 2013. Now they have an Argentinian pope. They haven't had an Italian since 1978. They want an Italian in on the next conclave.
It's interesting. What is the financial condition of the Vatican? Are they running on deficits? I mean, how are they functioning?
Well, the Vatican Bank numbers we never know, although they've given general numbers now that they had a slight drop in profits, but the Vatican Bank numbers have always been secret, and that's why you didn't know how much was involved in that. The Vatican itself, separate from the Vatican Bank, has been running a little bit of a surplus in recent years, very conservative on its investments, unaffected during the downturn of 2007 and 2008 because it wasn't involved in collateralized mortgages and all those crazy financial vehicles that got everybody in trouble in the West. But the Vatican is very good at doing one thing, and that is that almost every year you hear them say, we're running short of money. Please send in contributions. Help out the Pope. So they're always crying poverty, even on years when they have very good years.
Let me ask you, as we get down towards the end, on the pedophile issue, which they seem to have under much better control. I've always wondered what, on a relative sense, what percentage, as opposed to all these numbers that get thrown out. And you have a number in there that 1 year it might have been 10% of American priests. Did I read that right?
The highest number I saw I saw in any official report that it was a study that looked at it is 1 year could have been as high of accused of pedophilia, not convicted, not thrown out of the order or anything else, but had an accusation against him, could have been as high as 1 in 10 in that 1 year.
That's unbelievable.
It was a remarkable number. And then over time, less and less. The issue, and I have one chapter in there, as you know, about this, the issue for the Vatican was one major one, and that was money, meaning that they were concerned about the victims, but they were concerned about, is this going to affect Rome? Is this going to affect the Vatican?
Right.
What's happening out here in America, Ireland, and other places? So they made sure that every diocese was insulated. 11 have gone bankrupt in the U.S., but they didn't affect neighboring dioceses. And when the Pope was sued by American attorneys who said, you're head of the church, you're responsible for not having reined in the pedophiles, they were petrified that an American court might hold the Pope liable, and therefore the Vatican Bank and the Vatican might have to pay money. But eventually American courts, after years of appeals, finally said the Pope was sovereign. You couldn't sue him. And so the Vatican breathed a big sigh of relief when it came to the pedophilia scandals.
All right. In about 30 seconds, Pope Francis considered a populist, but ultimately doesn't seem to be really that flexible on doctrine. What do you see happening?
I agree with you. I think that people assumed that since he spoke and was popular that he was going to loosen up doctrine. I think of him as a conservative on doctrine who is absolutely almost progressive to being a socialist on his economic policies. When he comes to the U.S. in September, he's going to be tweaking Wall Street nonstop.
Always a brilliant interview with Gerald Posner. That book again, God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican by Simon & Schuster. If you're listening on our flagship station now, stay with us as we go into overtime. More on God's Banker, intrigue, financial scandal, money laundering, murder inside the Vatican Bank. We got a lot more stuff to talk about. Thanks to Gerald Posner. Thanks to our national audience for listening, and we'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. And welcome now to our segment 5, which is Overtime. It's exclusively for Yale Radio. From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, coming to you from 1540 WADK Newport. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. How about them Cowboys? We go inside the huddle of America's team in Jerry's world. Gary Myers has authored 3 prior books, The Catch, a look at the iconic 1981 NFC Championship game between the Cowboys and the Niners, Coaching Confidential, for which he was a guest on this show, which details the pressures of being an NFL head coach, and the New York Times bestseller Brady versus Manning. Gary's been covering the NFL since 1978. He's a contributor to The Athletic. He's a football talk show host on WFAN New York City, and was the Cowboys beat writer for the Dallas Morning News. He's a voter for the Pro Football Hall of Fame as well. And this book is just out. It's How About Them Cowboys, Inside the Huddle with the Stars and Legends of America's Team. Welcome back, Gary.
How are you doing today, Jim?
And I wanted to just start off by, since Ernie Palladino covered the Giants for 25 years, introduced us, say a brief remembrance. He recently passed away, tragic story. And I was with him exactly 1 year to the day when he died. And it was kind of eerie because after lunch at Smith & Walensky, I'm going to walk back to Grand Central. He's going back to Sloan Memorial, where he'd just come from some treatment to get his car, and he asked me to go with him, and he would drive me to the Grand Central. And I said, well, it's the opposite direction of where I'm going. So I go with him. We end up having to take a bus from one parking lot to another parking lot before we turn around and go back. So it made no sense, but he wanted to talk, and he talked about Coughlin and his ethics and everything. It was a kind of thing. And then for some weird reason, when I said goodbye to get out of the car, which, by the way, was several blocks from the station still, I put my arm on his cheek and said goodbye. And that was the last time I saw him, which I've never done with a guy before.
He was a wonderful guy, and I knew him for a very long time, and really, truly one of those people that you meet in life that nobody ever has anything bad to say about him. I mean, everybody really liked Ernie, and it's really true when you say about him, he was gone much too soon. I mean, he was just full of life and just, fun to be around. So I share in your feelings about him, and it's just very sad.
Yeah, very humble guy, too, even though he'd made such a big name for himself. All right, well, we're obviously here to talk about the Cowboys, but I hate to do this to you. I got to start off with my Giants. What the heck's wrong with them? They're like the worst team in football now.
Yeah, I mean, they're right there in the battle for the number 1 draft pick next April. I have to admit I'm really surprised at how bad they've been. Yeah. I didn't think they were going to be necessarily a playoff contender, although the NFC East isn't very good this season, but I didn't think that they were going to, be right there as one of the worst teams in the league. They attempted to do a rebuild on the fly here and stay competitive and contend while trying to turn over the roster and build. By midway of the season, they gave up on that and they started trading away some players. And I think it's all the second half of the season now is really just to find out who's on the roster that they think can help them win in the future. And it's only a matter of time, I believe, before.
Do you they replace McAdoo, they replace Reese with Shermer and Gelman. Is that the right move still long term?
Well, McAdoo appeared to be over his head in his second year, although he won 11 games in his first year. Yeah. So I could never really get a good read on him. Jim, I thought, his rookie year to win 11 games, that he would just get better, but he got worse. And so I thought, I by the end of the season, they fired him after 12 games, and not to even make it through his entire second season. I was kind of surprised it deteriorated that quickly, but ultimately it was probably the right move. Jerry Reese, his drafts got the Giants in this position, so his departure was probably a couple of years overdue. Whether Gettleman and Shermer are the right ones, we'll find out. There's been nothing to indicate so far that they're going to be able to get this turned around.
All right, we've got this guy, Jerry Jones, who's revolutionized the NFL, basically, but has not been a great GM. I guess talk a little bit. He bought the team for $154 million, which sounds like nothing, but I think in the book you say no team had ever gone for over $100 million, now worth $5 billion. Talk about him taking it over.
Yeah, the interesting thing, Jim, is that in the weeks and months leading up to his Hall of Fame induction, Jerry got very emotional talking about that period of time in his life, because he really did. I wouldn't say he scraped together pennies, but he scraped together his last million to be able to buy the team, and really put himself on the line to purchase a team that was losing $1 million a month.
Yeah, wow.
People don't realize that, as flashy as the Cowboys were and America's team and all that stuff, it was never a moneymaker because they didn't run it like a true business. They had absentee ownership pretty much, and Tex Schramm, who was the president and GM, operated the team like it was his own, although it wasn't his money. So everything was first class, and they didn't really pay attention to the bottom line. So Jerry took over an operation that had not been successful financially, and then it was doing really poorly on the field. They were 3-13 the year before he bought them, and so when he talked about that period of time in his life, and during my 3 different sessions with him for this book, and it totaled 5 hours, this came up a few times, and he genuinely had tears in his eyes. It was not. I was just really surprised, and he told me that he even asked his doctor why he got so emotional talking about that time, and it was 29 years ago, and his doctor said, you went through a very traumatic period because you risked everything you had, and it's amazing where the team was back then, at least financially and the way they operated, to where they are all these years later in Tunisia.
Worth $5 billion.
It's just run completely differently. They look to sponsor and get up and advertise, and basically every chair that's in the office.
Let me ask you about that. He essentially broke the socialism of the NFL, which refers to revenue sharing, which allows Green Bay to compete within the New York market. That ultimately proved a good thing, even though it looked very selfish. How do you come out?
Well, the backbone of the league, the foundation of the league, is really based on them sharing the TV money.
Yeah.
And the Giants were, at the forefront of that when they decided to do that in the early 60s, because, certainly in the biggest market in the country, they could have gotten more money and demanded more money than the other teams. But, Wellington Mara knew that in order for the NFL to really succeed, they had to be on somewhat of a level playing field financially, but Jerry felt they carried that too far, and that teams were prohibited from making their own sponsorship deals when the league had its own deals with, soft drink companies and beers and et cetera. So he went about getting sponsorships for the stadium, which he felt, didn't violate the league rules, because the stadium was a separate entity, and the league and Jerry wound up suing each other, and they settled, with no money exchanging hands. But Jerry basically won that fight, and then taught the other owners how to do it. And so I like to say that he he turned multimillionaires into multi-billionaires.
Yeah.
Because, the Giants, I keep using the Giants as an example, but Wellington Mara had some really nasty things to say. I mean, I remember the first game of the 95 season, Giants were opening at home against the Cowboys, and Jerry, right before kickoff, they distribute a press release in the press box announcing his partnership with Nike, and then Jerry is walking across the field with Phil Knight from Nike right before kickoff, and they were basically sticking it in the NFL's face. And but ultimately, he won that battle, and then he's in the Hall of Fame because of his business acumen, and that was the turning point in '95 when he got Nike and Pepsi and some other companies, sponsorships at Texas Stadium. Then all the teams started doing that.
In fact, as we finish this segment, I think this socialism is the reason the NFL has beaten Major League Baseball so badly over time with the parity. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell, the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. You can go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the internet to the stream, and access our podcast. We'll talk Jimmy and Jerry when we get back. I'm Jim Campbell, host of Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We're honored to be joining 1540 AM WADK weekdays 1 to 2 p.m., Monday through Fridays. We're so honored to have listeners in Middletown, Portsmouth, Tiverton, Jamestown, and, of course, Newport. Monday through Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. right here on 1540 AM WADK Newport. And our final national segment with Gary Miles, NFL expert, and it's always great to hear all of his insights. 24 years without a Super Bowl. Should the owner of the Cowboys have fired the GM by now? Oh, and by the way, the GM is the owner.
Yeah. I think if the GM was anybody but the owner, this particular owner for sure would have fired him a long time ago. But I will say this, and to Jerry's credit, that if he's completely outvoted...
Johnny Manziel.
Yeah, I mean, he was the only one in the room that wanted Johnny Manziel, the only one. And he went to the mat trying to fight for him, and he couldn't get one other person to agree, and they took Zach Martin, which turned out to be obviously the correct choice.
Pretty good move.
He's not a dictator in there, although he really should. His major fault here is he should have had a general manager
Gary,
after Jimmy left.
Answer this rumor. Did he ever want to be the head coach?
I think so. Yeah.
Jesus.
I don't think he ever will be, but you always see him down on the sidelines in the fourth quarter,
Yes.
and I wouldn't be surprised at some point he was whispering plays into Jason Garrett's ear. And who knows with all this wireless stuff going on now? He might even be doing that from his box upstairs.
Can you maximize the business function and the football performance? Because it doesn't seem he's been able to do that.
No, I mean he's been unbelievable on the business side,
Yes.
and not so on the football side. I think it's really too much for him to do, and I don't think he's got the background or the insight. I mean, he is more of a football guy than the other owners because he played.
Right.
But I mean, that was an awful long time ago, and things have changed. And it's not easy to go out and identify talent and rank the players and all that stuff. He has good people around him. It's just he needs that one strong football voice that's not him.
Okay, let's do lightning round.
Okay.
Colin Kaepernick, was he blackballed?
Yeah, I think he was. He has enough ability to play in the NFL. Certainly when you look around at some of the quarterbacks.
And you look at the Giants have nothing behind them right now.
Yeah, the Giants are about the last team that would ever sign him.
Yeah. Okay. What's the most overperforming team or teams right now to date this year?
The Chiefs are always a really good
Yes.
regular season team, but then they fall apart
Yes.
in the postseason because Andy Reid is a bad coach. I'll tell you one.
Andy Reid is a bad coach?
Let me say this.
Oh, bad playoff coach.
I'm sorry.
Got it.
Glad you caught that.
Wow.
He's a bad playoff coach.
Okay.
He's a great regular season coach. He's a bad playoff coach. You can always count on Andy to make a mistake and in a crucial spot in the postseason. I'd say the team that's maybe overachieving a little bit right now is Houston.
After a bad start, too.
because their two best players were coming off of serious injuries. With Deshaun Watson with the ACL, and J.J. Watt was just a list of injuries. But Watson, took a little while for him to get back to where he was, and so I would say Houston.
I thought Cleveland had a shot at the start, but I guess when you're 3-36.
Yeah, I mean they
okay, most underperforming team, is that the Giants?
Yeah, I would say that for sure.
All right, we've been moving to younger coaches. Who are the best younger coaches?
Well, I think there's one at the very top of the list, or maybe even two.
Okay.
Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan, for sure. And Sean McVay is such a young guy. He's only like 32, 33 now. And just a really bright guy who's able to command a room, even though a lot of the players are older than him. And Kyle Shanahan is just a really excellent coach.
That's interesting, because he's obviously hasn't turned anything around there yet.
Well, Shanahan?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, his quarterback got hurt this year.
Yeah, no. Best NFL coach, Belichick?
Well, yeah, I think you'd have to say it's Belichick. I wouldn't say he's the most likable, but I think he's the best.
Well, who's the best young quarterback?
Well, there's a lot of good young ones in the league right now. But, based on the first half of the season, you'd have to say it's Patrick Mahomes. It's just a dynamic talent. You have a lot of good, I like Carson Wentz. I like Jared Goff.
Darnold?
I think he's going to be very good. He's not there yet, obviously. He's going through the natural growing pains that all rookie quarterbacks, no matter who you are, there's always a period of time where they look like that they're lost.
Is Todd Bowles a good coach?
I think he's a pretty good defensive coach. I don't think he's a good head coach.
All right. Now, Belichick's had some trouble having his protégés be successful. Will Matt Patricia be successful?
I have my doubts about that one, but it's too early to really make a judgment. It's the first time he's ever been a head coach at pretty much any level, and he has a lot of Belichick in him, which is a good and bad thing, because too many of these guys, and Eric Mangini is the best example.
Oh, yes, exactly.
They try to be Belichick when there really is only one Belichick.
And that's the thing that Belichick was smart. He didn't try and be Parcells.
Well, he doesn't have the personality to be Parcells.
Right, but that's what Mangini did. He basically just tried to be even the same, even everything about him. Josh McDaniel, does he know what he's doing wanting to succeed Belichick?
I think he'd have a lot better chance of having success if Brady would stick around for him. This is a whole different discussion about who's more responsible, Belichick or Brady.
Yes.
But, Josh did not do well in Denver.
Yeah, personality.
I think he's grown up a lot since then, and I think he'll do better the second time around, but we don't know who his quarterback is going to be. It's unlikely to be Brady.
Is Gruden going to be successful in Oakland? Is he there to build, or is he just there for the brand to get into Vegas? I mean, he's been out of the game a long time.
Trading two of his best players.
Yeah.
One before the season, and Khalil Mack, and Amari Cooper, I think, has a chance, with Dallas now to really get back to where he was in his first couple of years. I'm not sure what Gruden is doing. You think if they're trying to, if it's for the brand's sake, you'd think they would have kept their best players.
Yeah,
try to be good going into
Gruden,
Las Vegas.
Gruden has always amazed me. Is he ran that quarterback camp? He's a quarterback girl. He's never been able to develop a quarterback in the NFL. He gives up on him too soon. Last question, Nick. Who's the next big turnaround right now? My Chicago Bears I grew up with?
I like the Bears. Trubisky hasn't been as quick to develop as say, Mahomes or Watson, and so much will depend on how he plays. But, their defense is real good. Let me see if I can give you a different team. No, I just don't want to agree with you on that.
Okay.
Just off the top of my head, I think the Chargers are a team. Well, I can't call them a turnaround team because they have a 37 or 38-year-old quarterback. But I would say, how about this? I'll say next year, assuming Garoppolo comes back healthy, that I thought the 49ers were going to be good this year. So if Garoppolo can get back to where he was, and he doesn't have a lot of experience, he's got a huge contract, but I think the Niners have a chance.
And you like Shanahan. He did not name the New York Jets for our producer here. Thanks to
I'm
Gary.
Sorry. In all honesty, I really think they need to change the coach before I can think they're going to be a real contender.
That's what I've been feeling. Thanks to Gary Myers. The book is How About Them Cowboys Inside the Huddle with the Stars and Legends of America's Team. And there's so much stuff in here. We're going to have him back on. But go read the whole book. It's been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Gary for a second time coming on. Thanks to our national audience. We'll see everybody next Wednesday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.